Here we go again. This time we're going to be talking about chapter 10. And the reason that I skip around the way that I do, the reason that I skip from starting you all out in chapter 1 to chapter 10 is because both of these chapters introduce so many terms that you're going to be hearing throughout the semester. They introduce a lot of terminology that I want you to be familiar with as we're talking about everything else, and so I try to go ahead and get those out first. And with this one, as you can kind of see on this particular screen, where I wrote in there, no, that's not from the book, it's from, I wrote it myself, get used to programs like literature focus units, literature circles, reading and writing workshop, and Basel readers. And I would ask, while you're going through this, and you are hopefully, if you have not read the chapter yet, I'm hoping that you might be reading through it as you're like going through the PowerPoints. But I would ask that you would take a look in your text at pages 328 to 331, because this chapter begins with a really cool little vignette that is happening in, I think it's a 4th grade classroom. And I love the way that it even begins, because it begins talking about a year-long author study. So this teacher must really like this author. And it says there's a busy hum in Mr. Singh's 4th grade classroom. A busy hum. You all will notice that whenever you're in your own classrooms. There's a difference between working noise or learning noise and noise for the sake of noise. It's this wonderful little busy hum whenever all of the students are working and know what they're supposed to be doing, and they're feeling confident about what they're supposed to be doing, and they're basically on task. But you have to be really prepared for that. And that's one of the reasons that after chapter 1 I wanted to cover this, is because it is a little bit of everything that we're going to be talking about that will make your classroom hum. So I'm really hoping that you'll please take a look at that and read through it, because this teacher is using kind of a reading and writing workshop set up in his classroom, and you might not do everything to the letter concerning reading and writing workshop whenever you're studying about it. Whenever you're looking at the PowerPoint that I added in for you to look at this week, that has links to videos of a, he's a little bit different, kind of an unorthodox type teacher, but the children absolutely love him, and he's doing reading and writing workshop right. Well, when you take a look at that, you might think, well, I'm not going to do all of that. Well, no, you don't have to, because that's what balanced literacy is. It means taking the best parts, and you're going to need to do that. Take the best parts of everything to create a balance in your classroom where you're doing everything that you possibly can to do right for your children. And this guy is using a reading and writing workshop in his classroom, and if you have any questions ever, whether it's on the quiz that you take this week, or whether it is even on one of your OSATs or something, if it has to do with what is considered the most student-centered method of teaching reading or writing in a classroom, it will be reading and writing workshop. Those are considered the most student-centered. And then therefore the most teacher-centered would be the Basel readers that are bought from companies, okay? But as you go through and start looking at it, want you to read through there to see what all he's doing. It mentions as one of the things that he's working on in his author study, which happens to be an author study about Chris Van Allsburg, who I love. If you've ever been acquainted with the Polar Express, if you've ever been acquainted with Jumanji, if you've ever read like, I think it's called The Stranger. Those are all by Chris Van Allsburg. One of my favorite books by him is called The Wretched Stone, I think is the name of it. And I'm hoping to get to share that with you all whenever we have our face-to-face class. But one of the things, or one of the components of a reading workshop, or even just of a good reading program period, would be to offer guided reading. And I've built into these that I've built in like the page numbers, because there's a really good chart if you get a chance to look on page 333 of your textbook, and that kind of breaks down guided reading into its different parts. But it kind of has an overview basically. But guided reading is used to teach usually small groups. Anytime you've been in a classroom where you might see them pulling the groups over to one side, one after another, that's usually what we would call a guided reading session. And the students most often are lumped into, or not, I shouldn't say lumped, that's not a good word, but into the levels that where all of them in the groups are as close to the same level as possible. And typically it's used with kindergarten through third grade. You don't really see it very often above that, but also if you have struggling readers, you'll end up doing guided reading with them. If you break it down, there is guided reading attachments that I've put in this week for you to go through and look at it. But very simply, if you break it down into about 5 parts or so, it would be about this. It takes about 20 minutes, okay, to do a guided reading with your students. The students will be rereading a familiar book or a passage that you all have been working on in the classroom. And then a new book will be introduced by you. You'll kind of give some background on it. You'll basically kind of do like a little book walk through it with you, or story walk through it with your students. And then you're going to set the purpose for what they're going to be reading. Do you have to plan ahead for all this? Of course you do. You're a teacher. If you're going to do right by your students, you're going to plan ahead so that it runs smoothly. You're going to be setting the purpose. You're going to be saying, okay, we're going to read this next page, and I want you to make sure that you are looking for something in particular that is found on that page. All right? Then you're going to have the students read very softly to themselves, basically while you listen. You're going to be going from student to student to student to kind of hear them reading softly to themselves. Then after that, you'll be having what we call a grand conversation. If you're not sure about a grand conversation, or you haven't heard that term before, in the back of the book on page 443, go back and look at that, because on page 443 it very simply tells you exactly how to have a grand conversation about what has just been read. And during that grand conversation, you're basically going to be doing things like you're going to be practicing. If they're very young, a lot younger students, you're going to be practicing with the whole phonics type stuff that you would see on those pages. You're going to be working on vocabulary. Were there any words there that they didn't understand or that they weren't sure of? Or if they're having trouble with one, you're going to break it down into different parts. But you're going to be including all of that into what you're doing. All of that is basically helping the students develop a stronger self-monitoring for themselves, and you'll see that on here. You're going to be going through, like whenever you first started reading with them, you may have had them make predictions when you were setting purpose. What do you think is going to happen? You're going to be going back through and checking those predictions. I mentioned the decoding unfamiliar words or determining if a word makes sense. You're going to be saying, okay, now, if you're not sure about this word, what do you think it means in this sentence? Does anybody have any idea within the syntax of the sentence? You're going to be having them reread something for you very quickly, something very, very short, just to kind of help them make sure that they're chunking their phrases a little bit more fluently so that you don't have a lot of very much word by word readers. All right? All of guided reading falls into the reading process. And we're going to be talking about the steps of the reading process here in just a little bit. One of the things that you're going to be getting used to is the term basal reading programs. A lot of schools, including one that you'll find not very far from ECU, are very much known as, they call them script schools, because there are some schools that follow basal reading programs so closely. They follow them to the letter. As a matter of fact, the school that I'm thinking of, they follow basal reading programs so closely to the letter that they tell the teachers, you're not putting yourself into this lesson. You are reading exactly what is on the script in the teacher's manual. Now, I'll tell you how much I like that very simply. Just ask me whenever you get a chance. Because I think that's wrong. I think that is setting limits. I think that is all part of the mindset of let's make a bunch of little robots. And I'm not just talking to kids, I'm talking to teachers too. It takes away the human factor of teaching reading. And it's wrong. Now, let's go back to whenever we mentioned last week about balanced literacy. If you are in a school where you find yourself that they are a script school, they go whole hog into whatever the basal reading program is that they chose, don't worry. I've been there too. However, once the door was closed, I tried to make my reading program much more balanced. Basal reading programs are not a terrible thing, but that's just it. They're not balanced literacy if you're not realizing that they're just a part of your reading program. There's good stuff from basal readers that you might use. I used to, like, if there were stories in the basal readers that that were along the same topic of maybe a children's book that we were reading, or even what we were studying. I remember when we were studying the Revolutionary War in 5th grade, which is a huge part of 5th grade social studies, and there was a really good story in our basal reader about the night crossing of the Delaware River of Washington and his men whenever they surprised the Hessians, and it was part of the turning point of the revolution for America. So, did I use that story? Absolutely. But did I do it by script? No. I used the story from the Basel Readers. Whenever I'm talking about script, I'm again, I'm telling you, a lot of people will literally read word by word exactly what it says. The teacher says, and they read word by word. Expected response from students will be, and they're waiting for the students to say something. Absolutely mind-numbing when you think about it. Takes away the human factor. And another thing that I always refused to use were those mind-numbingly boring workbooks. Those workbooks are worthless. They're busy work. I will say this. They might come in handy if you've used a story or having them do a story, because you're going to have a substitute. But try not to have a substitute unless it's absolutely necessary. The thing is, Basel reading programs are fine as long as you just make them part of balanced literacy. You want them to also have a lot of experience with good children's literature. You want them to have a lot of experience with more of a thinking and learning process, a give and take, expanding vocabulary, a lot of reading and writing involved. There's usually not a lot of writing involved with Basel reading programs other than filling out the workbooks. So think about that. Basel readers are fine, but they are not a part of a balanced reading program. When you are teaching with children's books, authentic literature, or trade books, you're giving the kids something that might help them become those lifelong readers that we're always talking about. Notice I've got here that there's no best way to teach reading and writing. As in everything else, you need a balance. Some people go whole hog and do nothing else except using trade books. And a lot of times, they do end up leaving out some part of the reading instruction that they need to include. So is it the thing that you use and use only? No, it's not either. It's a part of a balanced program. Whenever you are looking through this slide, know that, or notice that down where I have first, it says you are not teaching reading if you are not including writing instruction. I put rinse and repeat. Let me say that again. The very definition of literacy is the ability or the science to read and write. They go hand in hand. In order for the brain to process and work through learning reading and learning writing, they have to be taught hand in hand. And whenever you're using trade books, you can open it to a lot more writing. Whenever you are using children's literature in the classroom, you'll be hearing terms like what I have on this: literature focus units, literature circles, the reading and writing workshops that I mentioned earlier that's in your reading for this chapter, scaffolding, authentic instruction that they're always referring to. Get to know those terms. You'll find all of those throughout this chapter, and I'm wanting you to get used to them because you're going to be hearing them over and over and over again. Also, I've put on here that you need to start getting to know the 5 stages of the reading process and the writing process. I'm going to be hounding that constantly with you. You're going to be needing to get that down where it just sort of becomes reflex. You're going to need to realize that anytime you're teaching reading or you're teaching writing, that you can't leave any one step of the process out, or there will be gaps in your students' education. I've got on here page 334 is a good place for you to look at for those to find more information about those processes, but we're going to be talking about them a lot too. Whenever you're trying to teach with using trade books, bringing in a story from the Basils, using the literature circles, or putting together literature units like what you all are going to be doing this semester in this class, notice I've put down at the bottom that it's not the easiest way, but it's serving your students in the best way, because you're trying to bring in everything that you possibly can to affect more students. Remember, you already know that no one student learns the same way. So why would you try to teach reading in just one way? You're going to be wanting to teach reading including as many of these different strategies or these different ideas as possible in order to reach that many more students. I've included in all of this this week the steps in developing a literature focus unit, which kind of goes along with what you're doing. Notice I've got in here that whenever you're doing a literature focus unit in your classroom, select your literature. You're going to need to set goals. Find those standards that you're going to be covering or the skills that you want the students to know by the end of the unit. You know, you may have heard somebody say already that whenever you're planning to teach, you go at it by backwards design. Whatever it is that you want the students to know at the end of whatever you're teaching is how you plan where you're going with your teaching. You start with, first of all, find some good books that you might want to develop a unit around, but then decide which of the standards you're wanting to get out of the way while you're teaching that particular unit, and you develop the unit plan. Notice if you are looking through this and thinking back to the parts of the literature units that we went over last week and you are going to be putting together for this class, it kind of follows along with what is on this screen. And if you will look on page 340 of your textbook, you'll see a big overview on developing a literature focus unit. Now, I mentioned earlier about every time you, or every strategy that you use to teach reading needs to be a type of strategy that fits into the reading process. I want you to look at this because this is a little diagram of the steps of the reading process. Whenever you look at it, notice that the very first step is pre-reading. The teachers are building that background knowledge and they're trying to drum up some interest in the book that's going to be read. You're basically going to be giving a book talk. We mentioned book talks if you had children's literature with me. I believe it even talks about how to do a book talk in the back of this textbook as well. But you're trying to connect what's about to be read to what the students already know, and getting them set up that this is our purpose for reading. This is why we're going to be reading this, and this is why I think you're going to like this book. Maybe even introducing some of the characters. Then there's reading. The students are reading the book or they're hearing it read aloud. You go from the pre-reading. You can't skip the pre-reading. You can't go in and just say, okay, open your books to page 300 and we're going to start on the story on page 300. You've got to do the pre-reading part and set them up where they're ready to go on to the reading step of the process. Then notice it's got responding as the next step, where the students are participating in those grand conversations that I mentioned earlier. You're also having them, for example, respond to what they're reading through writing and reading logs. And there's a lot of different things about how to do reading logs in the addendum at the back of this book. Then you go into the next step, that is exploring, where the students are examining text factors, they're learning comprehension strategies, word study activities. This is also where you are teaching little mini lessons and trying to directly address that standard that you wanted to cover for this particular unit of study, or this particular book that you're going to be reading. And then finally, on the last step, notice it says applying, where students create visual, oral, and written projects. If you think back to the levels of Bloom's taxonomy, the reading process and the writing process are actually taking students more or less through the levels of Bloom's taxonomy so that they achieve real learning by the very end of it. You're going from very, very basic knowledge up through the steps to creativity, where you are having them take what they have just read or what they have just learned and actually turn it into something else. And you can't leave that out either. You're not just finished whenever you finish reading the chapter. And that's what so many teachers think you are, because so many teachers will go, okay, we're finished with the story, and then we're going to have a worksheet or two over it, and then we're going to have a quiz over it on Friday. Really? I bet those students just can't wait to read the next story, right? Give me a break. I know that everybody that's thinking about this realizes that no, this is real learning. When you're making sure that you're moving them through the process, not just going through the mind-numbing, hear it read, read, do worksheets, have a quiz. When we're talking about literature focus units, this was also mentioned last week, so we won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but you might be developing a unit around a particular novel. You might be developing a unit because you're wanting students to explore a particular genre, where all of the books have to do with a particular genre. You might be developing it around an author, like the teacher in the chapter this week likes to develop his around Chris Van Allsburg study. Also, there have been some great units featuring a particular picture book that go into a lot more depth simply because of the topic that is covered in the picture book, whether it be recycling or something like kindness, or something like diversity, or so forth and so on. A lot of good units can be developed around a picture book. And I've included in this, of course, the page numbers that you can look at directly in the book to come back to. And it might even help you when you're coming back and answering questions about these different areas on the quiz this week. You're going to hear a lot about things like literature circles, and notice I've got on here that one of the best ways to nurture a student's love of reading is to let them share. Let them share in literature circles. I've put in here that basically like little book clubs, kids like to be able to read and respond with each other or with other students who are reading one particular book or one particular story with each other in kind of like their own little book clubs. They think it's kind of look what we get to do. We get to have our own little clubs. And in your textbooks, it goes through the different key features of literature circles like choice, where they get to choose their groups and the books they will read. Very often, that's a little bit more with your guidance, of course. It kind of depends on basically how well functioning you've got your class going, okay? How smoothly you've got them working together. They get to select a book. You give them choices, and they get to select from that, maybe. And let them respond to each other. Notice I've got in here that they get to meet several times to discuss it. And I've got loaded into here different charts on pages 347, 348, 349, and 350 that I really want you to go back and look at that has to do with working with literature circles. Notice I've got steps in implementing literature circles here. There is kind of a series of steps. First of all, teachers choose the books after you suggest them. On page 355, I want you to mark that page, because on page 355, it has kind of a neat little inset of the Goldilocks strategy. You need to become familiar with that. You might even make a poster out of that to hang on your classroom wall, because it helps your students. It's kind of something to go by so that they realize whether or not a book is too easy, whether a book is too hard, or whether it's just right. See, get the Goldilocks strategy. As a matter of fact, on page 355, and I'm going to see if I can get to that right quick to go over it with you. The little figure on there I think is cute. That's why I say that you could turn it into a poster in your own classroom. Notice that it's even more or less geared toward children, because it says how to choose the best books for you. Notice that the too easy books, the book is short, the print is big, you've read the book before, you know all the words in the book has a lot of pictures, you're an expert on this topic. You whiz through the book too quickly. That's too easy. And then it tells you exactly about the just right and the too hard book. But become real well acquainted with that whole idea of the Goldilocks strategy, because that's a really important thing to be able to come back to always whenever you're helping your students select books. Then again, going through forming the literature circles with your help. They read a book, they talk about it. You come into each one of the book clubs and do little mini lessons over what you're wanting them to learn, or what standard that you're covering from while they're going through these particular books or stories. And then each one of the groups prepares a way to share it with the class. And there are 100 different ways to share books with the class, by the way, in the back of your textbook, in all of those activities. But there's also a lot of different ways to share books that you're going to hear about in your other classes, that you're going to read about in the Saravallo Strategies book, or that we're even going to talk about in here this particular semester. Whenever we're talking about literature circles and the reading process, I've already told you the steps of it, about the teachers giving book talk and introducing books and everything. That's that pre-reading. The students reading the book, that's the reading. The students discussing the book, that's their responding. They're doing different activities. You're meeting with them to teach mini lessons. That's the exploring. And then, of course, the applying is where they're giving brief presentations. I've even included a few of them in here that come from the back of this book. Notice I've got Sketch to Stretch, because that's one of my very favorites from page 473. Storyboards. I think you may even do storyboards in like Methods of Language Arts or something like that. Reader's Theater that a lot of you may have done, where you turn a story into a Reader's Theater and the kids kind of get to even act it out. There's a lot of them in the back of your book that I would really love for you to come back and look at if you get a chance. When we're talking about reading and writing workshops, and whenever you are looking at the little videos that I have in that PowerPoint on reading and writing workshops that I have loaded into this week, there's a lot of characteristics shared by them. For example, there's large chunks of time that are devoted to reading and writing. And whenever we're talking about large chunks of time, very often as you're going into the schools to do your student teaching or even to do your observations, you will notice that the elementary grade levels even have their days chunked up that way, where a huge chunk of time is devoted to English language arts. And so reading and writing workshop kind of lends itself to that, because you're covering everything about English language arts while you're going through the process of the reading and writing workshops. Students feel a lot more ownership. Remember I said it was the most student-centered type or strategy of teaching reading, because they are sharing and they're analyzing books together in these little book clubs that I just mentioned already, or going through a unit that you have put together over a particular book. They're getting to respond a lot about what they're reading. They're getting to share their writing that they're doing with classmates, because you're taking them through the writing process. And whenever I think I've got it loaded in as either next week or the week after, when we're going through the reading and writing process, you'll see very clearly exactly what I mean about the reading and the writing processes being absolutely matched up. But you're going to be, I've got in here that it fosters real reading and real writing, authentic learning. You're going to hear it over and over and over again. That is why in this particular chapter, page 353 to 363, look at that again on this slide. 10 pages is devoted to reading and writing workshop. Turning your classroom into a reading and writing workshop is going to be turning your students into lifelong readers and writers. I love that I've got built in here that it's not unusual for students to read 30 to 60 books a year when you're doing reading and writing workshops. It's not unusual for them to write 20 to 30 compositions a year when you're doing reading and writing workshop. These can be used as primary instructional approaches, or they can be used along other approaches, because there is the fact that you do mini lessons with them. You do have instruction built into this. On the next slide, I'll tell you why I just said that. This slide has the reading and writing workshop components in it. Notice that I've got them side by side so that you can actually kind of see what matches up with what. But I want you to look, I want everybody to look through this, because I've got it where it corresponds exactly with where you would find it on the pages in your text. But look down at the bottom of this, please, because it says note, SSR, sustained silent reading. A lot of people will say, oh, I do reading workshop in my classroom, when what it really is that they're doing is sustained silent reading. A lot of you might have grown up with SSR, or you might have grown up with a teacher who did drop everything and read, the DEAR time. That is great to have that built into a day, but it is not considered an instructional approach. SSR is supplemental, because instruction is not considered a factor of that particular approach, or that particular thing that you might be doing in your classroom. And I've got built in there that you can look ahead in your book to page 478 where it talks about that. Reading and writing workshop does figure into the reading process. Writing workshop figures into the writing process, which both of them match up perfectly. Like I said, you're going to be finding that out as we get into chapter 2, I believe. But basically, a lot to do with reading workshop. You might have read about when you read about interactive read alouds or interactive writing lessons that are part of what you're supposed to be reading and looking at this particular week. With pre-reading, the students and the teachers select books. The students read independently after maybe the teacher has read some to them too. The students conference with the teachers. They share with the other students maybe in their literature circles, if that's a part of it. Notice that all of this they can all fit in together. They can all be done like simultaneously. The exploring, the teachers are teaching little mini lessons covering those standards that you want the students to learn, and then applying, the students get to actually create, or they even get to give book talks to the class over what they've been reading. But it's fun for them. Kids tend to think that if it's not a matter of just having to open up a book and turn to a page and do worksheets, that you've actually given them something special. You've actually given them a little bit of freedom. Incorporate all of this into your classroom whenever you're teaching, so that you can truly feel that you're giving them much more of a balanced approach. Now again, I'm going to back up. We're going to be spending a week on early literacy. I'm talking pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, where I will tell you as a reading specialist that it is more structured in those particular grade levels. I've seen reading and writing workshop done absolutely flawlessly and beautifully in like kindergartens, and you can probably even look up on YouTube like a reading workshop done in a kindergarten classroom. But just let me say, I feel like there's so much to get drilled into them in pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade to get that foundation laid for their later on literacy skills that to me, in grades 2 through 6, this is all about creating lifelong readers. It's all about creating a joy of reading for these students. And I think you will. I hope you have a good week, and whenever you are in class, please ask me any questions over this that you might have.